Okay, my last example of effortful processing is the strategy called organization. There are, there are a couple of different organizational strategies that you can use that can lead to good memory. One strategy that you can use is to actually sort of cluster information into units so that you actually have fewer things to remember. We call this chunking. Um, if you're provided with this string of digits to remember, it's going to be well outside of your short-term memory store, and it's going to be hard to remember enough of them to transfer it accurately over into long-term memory. But if instead you chunk and tell yourself, okay, I have 4 important dates in American history to remember, you're going to have a higher probability of remembering these 4 dates than if you try and remember 16 individual numbers. So chunking is a really good strategy, and usually it doesn't take that much effort. It doesn't take that much pre-planning to do some chunking. Acronyms are another way that you can organize information into manageable bits that makes it easier for you to find it, retrieve it, things like that. Now, sometimes people use the word acronym incorrectly, so I like to give you examples of what we're talking about. Here we have an acronym that helps us to remember the 5 Great Lakes. I was told that there was order implied in these, but then I recently looked these up on the map, and there's no order of size included in this. So maybe it's from east to west or something. All I know for sure, though, is when I see the word homes, it helps to trigger for me the 5 names of the Great Lakes. Even though, I was born and raised on the West Coast, and so a lot of things in the middle of the country or east just sort of gets all globbed together in my mind because they all run together. So I don't have great familiarity with the area, but it's simple for me to remember that something starts with H, and there's a narrow band of things that would be viable candidates for that letter. When I was a student studying cranial nerves, I would name the cranial nerves for you, but I hadn't used very effective strategies for encoding it, so I have to look up cranial nerves every time I want to try and remember what they are. I know there's a vagus nerve. I know that there's 2 that start with an H. That really was a problem for me with my acronym I tried to use, because when I came to the second H, I was like, wait, I already used H. Whoa, no, what was the other H, right? So you've got to have an effective plan for what your acronym is going to be if it's actually going to cue you to remember things. Roy G. Biv, you might have learned this to help you to remember the colors of the rainbow. I recently read in Discover magazine that they are starting to think that possibly violet is not a separate color. So we may have to come up with a new device if they decide to come up with that, because Roy G. Biv is even less sensible than Roy G. Biv. How is violet not a color? But anyway, obviously that's not my field. I don't get to name the colors. You use acronyms probably pretty frequently without even knowing it. Like the word scuba is originally an acronym for self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. But some acronyms become simpler to use, and then people actually have lost what they originally referred to. So it only works as a mnemonic device if you remind yourself, okay, I'm going to use this word, and this word is going to cue me that there are other words that are represented by each of these letters. You have to remember that if you're using it as a strategy. Another way of organizing information so that it's easier for you to store it and then easier to find is to organize the information hierarchically. My slides are hierarchically organized, right? We got the number 3, then we got the big dot indentation, then we got the little dot indentation. That imposes meanings that you know that under the topic of encoding, and then I've got over there on the right-hand side the little box that says effortful processing, so we know we're talking about things that take effort. And then we've got the third topic in that area, organization, and then there are 3 things that we're talking about, right? That helps you to organize so that you know what goes together, so that when you're encoding it, you put together those things that belong together. Now here's another way that you could do hierarchies. Outlines are one. Here's another way. There are a lot of these kinds of diagrams in your textbook, right? I know I showed one for the organization of the central nervous system, right? So you can kind of see how things relate to each other and how things break down. All right, so I personally find these to be the easiest of the effortful strategies for actually having effective memory without having to do a whole bunch of repetition. Now here's the thing. You do best if you're going to use organization if you impose your own organization. Part of why my cranial nerve memory might not have been so good is because my group mates came up with the acronym and then I tried to use their acronym. Had I made up something that made sense to me, it probably would have produced better memory. When I was in math, I was taught the FOIL method. The FOIL method, that's an acronym. Um, Now, here's where it can get confusing because that was offered to me. It was imposed on me because that is the acronym. Here's where I got confused. We had a teacher at school whose name was Mr. Foyle, Foyle. And so I must have missed the day when they introduced the acronym for FOIL method. So when I heard it in class, well, now we're going to use the FOIL method, I assumed that our other math teacher, Mr. Foyle, must have developed this method. I never put it together that it was FOIL and that those letters represented the order of what you were supposed to be doing with the, addends or multiplicans or whatever we were doing. Anyway, if you impose your own organization, you will remember it better. So then you might be saying, well, teacher, why did you organize your slides into hierarchies for us if we would remember it better if we impose our own meaning? One of the things that research has shown is that when you're a novice in an area, such as Intro to Psych, it's really difficult to figure out what the organization should be and what would make the most sense. So that's, they actually, for novices, recommend introducing things in an organized fashion. Among the things that are in your textbook and that I've been talking about, if you want to impose chunking or acronyms or hierarchies of your own, it'll make the material more memorable. Okay. Okay, so let's assume you got it in. Let's assume you transferred the information into at least short-term and hopefully into long-term memory. Let's talk about how information is stored. So the idea is that there are events out in the world and that those events are going to impinge on your sensory memory. You're going to pay some attention to some part of those events and move it into your short-term or working memory. If you process it deeply enough or in an organized enough fashion or whatever, you'll transfer that information from working memory into long-term memory where theoretically it will be permanently stored. If you want to think about it again, then you have to retrieve it back out of long-term memory. But let's talk about how it's retained. Okay. Since the 1960s, we've been thinking about human memory as being a lot like computers. And it's not a bad model. It's really not. I was just having this really interesting conversation with my son who's a IT major. That's not the right term for it, but information systems and technology, I think it's called. Anyway, we were talking about it and we realized that we really kind of study the exact same thing. It's just for him it's the computer's brain and for me it's the human. Because they do work very similarly. Okay, so long-term memory. Your memory is not like a hard drive in one way, and that is that the hard drive stores whatever has been placed into its short-term memory, intact, accurately, and in a retrievable fashion. It's always retrievable, it's always readable, it's always the same as it was when it went in. You are not like that. You store parts, you make inferences, you mix things up. Instead of you holding things permanently like a hard drive and accurately, you're a little less precise, in part because we rely on these biological connections, these neural networks, to store our memories. And if you don't do the right things to get the information stored into your long-term memory, a bit might get lost. It's really contingent on your brain to figure out which parts are important and need to be included and which parts are irrelevant and can be ignored. The computer doesn't have that problem. Everything you type into it is assumed to be important and it'll store it. Everything you draw into it, like if you're making drawings or whatever, it'll assume it's important, it'll store it. When you tell it to. That's the other part that's different, is that you don't take little snapshots where you periodically with your brain go, you know what, I I should store this. Click. Okay, got it. You can't do that. So some of the structures and things, the organization might be similar, but we've got some serious differences between us and computers. Another thing that differs between us and a hard drive is that our brains never get full. You, it, you could never fill up your brain for a couple of reasons. One is your memories are not actually stored in your neurons. Like some people have asked me in class, well, if we have a finite number of neurons, wouldn't we ultimately get a memory in every neuron and then possibly we're done? Well, two things. You have so many neurons in your brain that there's no way you have a memory stored in every single neuron. Number two, you don't store memories in your neurons. When you represent a memory, you actually grow new connections between your existing neurons. So you're never going to run out of space because you're always growing new ones. New memories demand new connections. So your existing neurons, now way back in Chapter 2 we talked about your dendrites and how they can reach out and make connections with neighboring cells. Those dendrites grow your entire life. They're always growing and reaching out and making connections with neurons that they have some reason to believe they're related to. Each connection, each synapse, represents a bit, a component of a memory. So we'll talk about retrieving memories in another segment, so I don't want to get ahead of myself. I have to try and really stay on track when I'm doing these recorded lectures and not deviate like I can in person. So you make new connections when you form a new memory. Okay, now earlier I talked about the semantic memory store and that it houses those things you know you know. Another term for semantic memory store is explicit memory. Explicit memory is comprised of all those facts, stories, things that you know. And then it also includes the meanings of words, like your awareness of, the definitions of words. It's that semantic memory store, right? Meaning. So the simple way of saying explicit memory is, to characterize it would be to say it contains all the things you know, just like we say with a semantic memory store. Those names are interchangeable, explicit and semantic. Now the hippocampus is really important in the formation of these kinds of memories. As information comes into your sense organs, that information is sent to your hippocampus. Your hippocampus does a lot of things for your current awareness, like your awareness of sitting and listening to this lecture, or your awareness of your position in space, your awareness of your state of hunger, like all that stuff. Your hippocampus manages a lot of those things. And this is going to be, I'm mentioning this now because this is really relevant for when we talk about schizophrenics, because their hippocampuses are organized in a disorganized way. As information comes into our hippocampus, we store it for some amount of time for potential permanent storage. Now, how long is that some amount of time? Oh, that's a topic of debate in psychology. Somewhere between 30 seconds and about 2 weeks is pretty much where the debate is falling. That's a pretty broad range. So it's held for some amount of time is what I like to say, before consolidating the information. Consolidating means to move the information to other parts of the brain for ultimately long-term storage. If you look at the diagram on the right, you've got the hippocampus in red. You've got one on either side. And then see those white dots on the cortex? That's the illustrator's attempt to show you that memories can be transferred anywhere in your cortex for permanent storage. So once you have consolidated a new memory, it's moved up to the cortex and become, a synapse or a series of synapses among, neurons. That act of consolidation mostly occurs during REM sleep. People who are deprived of REM sleep have very little success in consolidating new memories. People who are REM sleep indulged do much better. If they're allowed to sleep all night without us waking them up, they do much better at retaining like a list of words that we taught them yesterday, things like that. So REM sleep seems to be really super important for the storage of memories. Okay. Now, implicit memory is the things you do without thinking about them. So it's skills, it's the series of steps that you need to implement in order to complete some procedure. And then all those conditioned associations that we talked about in Chapter 7, classical conditioning and operant conditioning, occur in implicit memory. So if explicit memory is all the things you know, implicit memory is all the things that you don't have to consciously know you know. The cerebellum is the really important structure in this kind of memory. The cerebellum, we know that if we teach you to blink your eye because a puff of air is coming, and then sever part of your cerebellum, it'll be like you never got conditioned with that. The puff of air will be a surprise to you. We know that the cerebellum is really important for that. The basal ganglia is really important for and see the picture of the basal ganglia is pointing at that region that kind of separates the frontal. It's near the frontal lobe, but it's part of the limbic system. And it's really important for your acquisition of procedural memory, and then other kinds of motor skills, like how to swing a golf club and how to ride a bike and things like that would be controlled there. So these are the kinds of things that, how they say you never forget how to ride a bike? Well, that's because it's housed in parts of your brain where you don't need conscious awareness in order for you to be able to do that behavior again. I had completely forgotten how to play the piano till the kids started playing the piano, and I got a piano. I hadn't had one in the house since, oh my gosh, 1975 or something, right when I was a little kid. So we got a piano for the kids, and I said, I used to play the piano, and they go, well, play it, Mom. I'm like, I don't remember how. So I sat down in front of it. I started muffing it up a little bit. I was like, oh, nope, yeah, see, I can't play it. But then once I stopped thinking about it and just let my fingers go, I was able to play the beginning, opening little strains of a song that was really popular when I was a kid called The Entertainer. Da 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 da. I was able to play that just one-handed. I couldn't remember the left hand's job or anything. But it took me a little struggling around, goofing around with the keys, and then my procedural once I stopped thinking about it, my procedural memory let me do it. And that's the thing. A lot of times with athletes, they start to choke when they start thinking while they're doing the task. You can't think about it once it's become a procedural memory, or else your thinking will actually interfere. Okay, let's go ahead and stop here. We'll come back in the next segment. We'll talk about how do we get that information back out of our brains.